The phrase "the worst year ever" gets thrown around casually now, mostly online and usually about trivial annoyances like being let down by the latest Star Wars movie. But historians and scientists have argued that, in the long record of Earth, one year stands out above the rest: 536 CE. There are plenty of bleak candidates across history, yet few single years produced consequences that affected the world so broadly and so persistently. Today we'll explain why 536 is widely considered the worst year to be alive. Before we begin, subscribe to the Past to Learn channel, drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell us what era we should cover next. Alright, time to settle the debate. Year 536, worst year ever. While traveling in Sicily in 536, Procopius, the Byzantine historian who acted as military secretary to the great general Belisarius, recorded something strange. The sun gave light, but not the way it normally does. He described it as resembling the moon, as if the sun's rays were dimmed and blurred. In his account, the daylight was weak and strange for an extended period. Procopius wasn't alone. Michael the Syrian, writing later, recounted that the sun grew dark for 18 months. Day lasted only a few hours, and that little light felt like a faint shadow. People feared the sun would never fully recover. Fruits failed to ripen, and wine turned sour. This dimming was not merely a poetic image. It reflected an extraordinary climatic event that darkened skies across much of the world for at least a year. Researchers later tied this to a colossal volcanic eruption whose aerosols and ash veiled the atmosphere, producing a prolonged pall of dust and particles. The result was widespread gloom, cooler temperatures, and agricultural collapse. Even grapes stopped making good wine. That is strike one against 536. Plants rely on sunlight. Depriving crops of normal solar energy devastated harvests. The lack of direct sunlight, combined with immeasurable global cooling, produced crop failures on a continental scale and a cascade of famines. Scientists estimate average global temperatures dipped between roughly 1.6 and 2.5 degrees Celsius, not trivial when considered across decades. Those cooler conditions persisted and made recovery slow. Contemporary reports from places like Ireland noted catastrophic food shortages, a crisis they called the bread failure. Dark skies and cold were not the only dangers. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, and diseases spread more easily among hungry populations. Plague arrived in this context, striking civilians and palaces alike. Accounts describe a sickness that often began with a sore on the hand, then produced swelling and painful buboes. Ultimately, many could not walk. When the epidemic reached Constantinople, the city was overwhelmed. Dead bodies were thrown into the sea to cope with the sheer number of fatalities, only to wash back ashore later. Burial systems were simply unable to handle the toll. Emperor Justinian ordered the removal of corpses, but moving the dead only spread pathogens and exposed the living to more risk. The epidemic later became known as the Plague of Justinian, a catastrophe that historians estimate claimed many millions of lives. The climate disruptions reached China as well. Chronicles from the 6th century record odd dust rain, a yellow, ash-like substance falling from the sky that locals called hui. Reports describe summer frosts and snow in months that should have been warm, wiping out crops. In some regions, entire harvests failed and famine followed for years. In certain cities, historians estimate mortality rates as high as 70 to 80%. This was more than isolated bad weather. It was systemic environmental breakdown. Ice core records from Greenland and Iceland show evidence of major volcanic aerosol deposition dated to the mid-6th century. Later eruptions in Iceland in 540 and 547 amplified the dark period. Some scientists propose a powerful tropical eruption, perhaps in Central America, around 535 to 536, which, when combined with the northern eruptions, pushed the northern hemisphere into what has been called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. The repeated injections of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere blocked sunlight, cooled the planet for years, and crushed agriculture. The sequence of volcanic events and the resulting cooling led to famine and elevated mortality, both directly and indirectly. By the 6th century, the Roman imperial administration had shifted east to Constantinople. Under Emperor Justinian, the Romans attempted to regain lost territories and revive imperial power. Generals such as Belisarius achieved notable military victories against groups like the Goths and Vandals, but the overall revival was hampered by social unrest, recurring uprisings, and now by biological catastrophe. The plague and the famines that followed hurt the Byzantine Empire's manpower and economic base. Contemporary estimates suggest dramatic population declines, with some scholars proposing that Justinian's realm lost a third to over half of its people during the mid-6th century plague outbreaks. The combined effects of war, famine, and disease damaged state capacity and altered the trajectory of Mediterranean history. The calamity was not limited to Europe and Asia. On the western coast of South America, the Moche civilization faced its own environmental crisis. An unusually strong El Niño event warmed coastal waters, decimating fish stocks that the Moche relied upon. Flooding damaged irrigation systems crucial to agriculture. The result was widespread food shortages that undermined this once vibrant society's economic stability. Concerned scholars sought to quantify all of these fragments of evidence and test whether a single year could legitimately be labeled the worst. Harvard historian Michael McCormick and a team of interdisciplinary researchers began by examining coinage, metal production, and other economic indicators in the early medieval period. Their investigations expanded into environmental science, dendrochronology, means tree ring studies, ice core chemistry, and more. Ice cores and tree rings revealed a sharp pulse of volcanic sulfate and a distinct growth downturn in trees, signals that correspond closely to the mid-6th century. In particular, volcanic deposits in Greenland and Iceland match dates centered around 536, corroborating written sources that described a sudden and sustained decline in sunlight and temperature. Dendrochronologists studying northern hemisphere trees found narrow rings indicative of poor growth during the mid-500s, a clear biological signature of cooling and stress. Combined with the ice core evidence, these physical records anchor the historical descriptions to a real, global environmental disturbance, and they point squarely to 536 as the start of a particularly brutal sequence of years. But the research also uncovered how recovery began. McCormick and colleagues noted chemical signatures in later ice layers, traces of lead, for example, that indicate resumed metalworking and renewed minting activity. The reappearance of silver production implies economic recovery and increased coin circulation, an early sign that markets and societies were beginning to rebound. That is not to downplay the suffering of the period, but it does show that the crisis, while severe and long-lasting, did not spell permanent collapse everywhere. So, 536 stands out because a powerful volcanic forcing triggered a global cooling, crop failures, widespread famine, and made populations vulnerable to pandemics. The combined toll was staggering. Regions across the world recorded parallel catastrophes. Europe grew colder and hungrier. The Byzantine Empire's ambitions were compromised by plague. China suffered dust rains and unseasonal frosts, and societies like the Moche endured El Niño disruptions that devastated food supplies. The physical evidence, ice cores, tree rings, and contemporary chronicles all line up to show that this was not merely a bad year in one place, but a planetary-scale shock whose aftereffects reverberated for decades. That is why many scholars peg 536 as the worst year to be alive in recorded history. What would you do if you could travel back to 536 and try to survive? Tell us in the comments.